Black pastor vanished in 1977. 25 years later, a logger finds this under a tree stump. The summer air was thick that morning in my small Arkansas apartment. Outside my window, the slow hum of cicadas signaled another sweltering day in the Ozarks. Inside, I sat alone in my worn recliner, staring at the muted television screen. A preacher in a pinstriped suit paced the stage on some local cable channel. His words, though unheard, stirred something in me. They reminded me of Dad. Reverend Elijah Freeman wasn't just my father. He was the voice of our town's soul, a calm, commanding presence behind the pulpit at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. His sermons echoed with the slow southern drawl of a man raised on both scripture and struggle. He had marched, not just preached, and he had healed people's spirits with his gentle touch and fierce integrity. But one day in 1977 he vanished, just disappeared. No note, no farewell sermon, only silence. I was 17 then, angry, scared, and not ready to be alone. In the years that followed, I tried to forget. I sold our family home, boxed up Dad's books, and buried my faith beneath layers of doubt. I stopped attending church. I stopped praying. What kind of God let a good man like my father vanish without a trace? That Friday morning in 2002, as I reached for the remote, the phone rang. "Mr. Freeman, this is Detective Sarah Miller from the Crawford County Sheriff's Department." Her voice was calm, practiced. Still, it made my heart lurch. "We believe we've found something related to your father's disappearance." Time stopped. She explained that a logger clearing timber on private land deep in the forest had uncovered something buried beneath a rotted tree stump. A vintage Adidas gym bag. Inside it, a pastoral robe and a water-damaged Bible. It had your father's name written inside, in pen. I gripped the phone tighter. That bag. Dad never owned anything Adidas. He wasn't a man for brands. He wore the same 2 pairs of shoes every Sunday, both scuffed, both polished. This didn't make sense. "We'd like you to come out and identify the items," she added. A wave of memories hit me, like the thick southern heat, Dad's voice, reading scripture, the smell of old hymnals, the red bricks of our church glowing in the sunset. I said yes. I didn't know it then, but that call would pull me back into a story I thought had ended decades ago. Back into secrets buried under roots both literal and spiritual. And back into the war my father had been fighting alone. The police cruiser glided silently down the winding road that cut through the Ozark foothills, its tires crunching on the frost-rimmed gravel. I sat in the back seat, my hands nervously clasped together. The morning sun filtered through a thin veil of mist, casting elongated shadows across the evergreens. Each mile we traveled seemed to stretch the invisible thread connecting me to a past I had long buried, one I had run from, and yet could never quite leave behind. Detective Sarah Miller sat quietly in the front passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at me through the rearview mirror. Her expression was calm but alert. She was a woman hardened by years in the field, but not unkind. There was a quiet empathy in her eyes, the sort I had come to mistrust in most people, but something about her gaze made me pause. "We're almost there," she said softly, turning around slightly. I nodded. I knew these woods. My father and I had once hiked them on Sunday afternoons after services, before my mother's passing and long before his disappearance. I remembered the scent of pine sap and the rhythmic crunch of twigs underfoot. I remembered how he used to quote Psalms as we walked, his voice steady and warm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." That was before everything fractured. As we approached the taped-off clearing, I could see the flurry of activity ahead. Police officers milled about their uniforms, stark against the soft brown of the forest floor. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, encircling a large, partially exposed tree stump. A backhoe stood idle nearby, its mechanical arm poised mid-air like a sleeping giant. A logger in a faded flannel shirt and work boots stood beside a patrol officer, gesturing animatedly with a shovel in hand. As I stepped out of the cruiser, Detective Miller introduced him. "This is Tom Jenkins," she said. "He's the one who made the discovery." Tom extended a large, calloused hand. "Morning. I hate that we had to meet under such circumstances." I shook his hand, the chill of the morning seeping through his skin. "Thank you for contacting the police. Can you show me what you found?" He nodded and led me to the stump. The air was thick with damp earth and something older, a smell like wet leather and time. At the base of the rotted stump was a weathered Adidas duffel bag, partially unzipped. Inside, neatly folded, were a pastoral robe and a water-stained Bible. I didn't need to read the name etched on the inside cover. I already knew. "That's his," I murmured, my voice hoarse. "That's my father's Bible." Detective Miller leaned closer. "You're sure?" "Yes," I said firmly. "He used to sign the inside flap of every Bible he owned. That handwriting, I'd know it anywhere." Carefully, the officers removed the items and placed them on a table under a nearby canopy. They examined each piece with reverence. The robe was damp but intact. The Bible's pages were stuck together, yet portions were still legible. A folded piece of paper slid out from between the pages, a handwritten prayer. It read, "Lord, protect me from those who claim to serve you, but walk in darkness. Help me stand strong in the face of deception." The words sent a chill through my spine. Tom rubbed the back of his neck. "The tree was cut down about 20 years ago. Whoever buried that bag dug beneath it before the stump rotted out. That wasn't no accident." Detective Miller glanced at me. "We're sending the items to the state lab for DNA testing. In the meantime, we'd like you to confirm anything else that might help identify them as your father's." I touched the robe gently, its fabric still familiar to me. This was his size. He wore it every Sunday, even in the heat. Said God deserved our best, even if it made us sweat. Tom looked down at the stump. "We found a few bone fragments in the soil. Might be animal, but we'll know soon enough." I swallowed hard. My father buried under a tree in the middle of the woods. No grave, no service, no answers, just silence. Back at the station, I sat in the evidence room, staring at the recovered items. The detective had gone to make calls, leaving me alone. I opened the Bible again, gently peeling the damp pages apart. There, toward the back, was another note. It wasn't a prayer this time, it was a list of names. Pastor Harold Whitmore, Reverend George Langston. Next to each was a word lightly scrawled in pencil, suspect. My heart pounded. These were men my father had trusted, fellow clergymen at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. I remembered their faces, their booming voices during sermons, their laughter after service potlucks. But I also remembered the hushed arguments behind closed doors, the long nights my father stayed at the church alone. My father had suspected them of something. The realization settled like a stone in my gut. I thanked Detective Miller and requested permission to visit the old church. She agreed on the condition that I report anything I found. "Be careful," she said. "If your father was onto something back then, we don't know who might have known or what lengths they'd go to keep it buried." I nodded solemnly. Mount Olive stood less than 15 minutes away. As I pulled into the gravel lot, memories washed over me. The white clapboard building looked exactly as I remembered, small, but dignified, with a tall steeple and a rusted bell. The front door creaked as I opened it. Inside, sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting mosaics of light across the pews. It was empty still and quiet. I walked slowly down the aisle, my fingers trailing along the worn wood of the pews. At the altar I paused, staring at the cross. I remembered kneeling there as a boy, watching my father preach with a fire that could move hearts. I remembered how he used to close every sermon with a smile, and the same phrase, "Walk in truth, children," even when truth is a hard road. I made my way to the church office. The door was unlocked. The room smelled of dust and old books. I scanned the shelves for anything familiar, and there it was. A set of old financial ledgers. One caught my eye. 1977, quarterly church expenses. I flipped through it quickly. At first, everything looked normal, but then I noticed something strange, large, unexplained withdrawals in early spring, right before my father disappeared. Thousands of dollars, cash, no recipients listed, no explanations. I ran my fingers down the columns, noting the handwriting. Then I turned to the back, a margin note scribbled hastily. H. Whitmore, questioned. G. Langston, defensive, more to follow. My father had been investigating this, and he had written it all down. I turned toward the window, heart thudding. The past wasn't just knocking, it had kicked in the door. The scent of cedar and wild jasmine hit me as I stepped out of the car and into the parking lot of Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. The wood-paneled building stood much as I remembered it, weathered but stalwart against the Arkansas sky, like an old friend holding secrets close to its chest. I hadn't seen this place since I was a teenage boy, full of grief and anger, unwilling to accept the silence my father's disappearance had left behind. Stepping through the familiar front doors was like opening a time capsule. The same soft creak of the hinges, the same narrow hallway adorned with photos of past pastors and deacons, my father's portrait among them, proud and humble. I paused there longer than I should have, tracing the outlines of his face with my eyes. It was as if he were still watching over this place. I moved down the hall toward the sanctuary heart, pounding, unsure what I would find or feel. I was here on a mission driven by a newfound sense of duty and yearning. I needed to know who my father had been in those final days. And more than that, I needed to understand why he had vanished and left a hole in my life that had never quite healed. Inside the sanctuary, the space glowed with shafts of sunlight filtering through stained glass, painting the pews in blues and reds. I could almost hear my father's voice echoing from the pulpit, delivering one of his impassioned sermons. I blinked back tears and made my way to the church office. To my surprise, I found Pastor Harold Whitmore and Reverend George Langston already there. They looked older now, gray at the temple's eyes, lined with age, and something else, weariness, perhaps. I introduced myself, and recognition dawned on their faces, slowly followed by a mixture of warmth and discomfort. "We never stopped praying for you, Marcus," Pastor Harold said as he grasped my hand. I explained the discovery in the forest, the vintage Adidas bag, the robe, the Bible. As I spoke, their faces grew solemn. I saw something flicker in George's eyes, a shadow of something unspoken. "Your father was a good man," George said finally, his voice strained. "Whatever happened, I'm sure he never intended to leave you like that." But the way he avoided my gaze told me there was more. I asked them directly about the missing 1977 sermon notebook and diary, my father's last written words. Both men seemed caught off guard. "He always kept his notes here at the church," I said, "but the volumes from 1977 are missing." They exchanged a glance that said more than words. We checked his old office, now used by George. The drawers were neat, the bookshelves dusted, but the 1977 volumes weren't there. We moved on to the library, where we spent nearly an hour digging through archives, storage boxes, old hymnals. Nothing. Disheartened, I thanked them and began to leave. But then, in a moment of divine irony, I left behind my own notebook, the older volume I had brought from home. I didn't realize it at the time. From there, I drove to my mother's grave. The sun was beginning to dip behind the Ozark Hills, casting long shadows over the cemetery. I sat by her headstone, telling her everything as I used to as a boy. I didn't realize how much I needed that moment until I was deep in it, speaking aloud the worries I hadn't shared with anyone in years. That's when I heard the soft weeping. I followed the sound and found a boy, Robbie, curled up beside a grave. 10 years old at most, his cheeks streaked with tears, his jacket too thin for the coming evening chill. He told me his aunt and uncle didn't want him around. I saw too much of my younger self in him to walk away. "Come with me," I told him. "Let's get you somewhere safe." We agreed on the hospital, but he asked me to bring him communion afterward. He believed it would help him get better. His mother had taken him to church for Holy Communion whenever he was sick. It struck a chord. My father had done the same. After checking Robbie into the ER and leaving him in the care of a nurse, I returned to the church for the communion kit. There, a young staff member helped me retrieve both the set and my forgotten notebook. As I was leaving, something caught my eye, a heavy book teetering on the top shelf. I reached for it, and by chance found a handwritten note in the margins. My father's handwriting. The book was about church finances and stewardship. The marginalia was damning. 2 names, Harold and George, both circled, question marks, notes about impropriety, betrayal, and fear, the kind of annotations someone might make when they're unsure who to trust. With the communion set in hand and my father's old sermon notes clutched under my arm, I headed outside only to spot Harold and George in the church cemetery. They were digging. Under the cover of twilight, they stood over a mound of disturbed earth, a shovel in George's hands, and a large cloth-wrapped bundle resting beside them. My stomach turned. I approached casual but alert. "Evening," I said. They startled. Harold tried to explain they were relocating a pet's remains. A dog buried years ago. The explanation sounded rehearsed, forced. I let them speak. I didn't confront them. But I knew. Something wasn't right. I excused myself and walked to my car, but I didn't leave. Instead, I watched. And when I saw George load the shovel and bag into his car and speed off, heading not toward town, but toward the woods, I made a choice. I followed. What followed next felt like something out of a Southern Gothic thriller. A winding road through the forest, the sky darkening fast. I called Detective Miller. She told me to stay back to wait, but I couldn't. I had come too far to turn back now. I trailed Reverend George's taillights through the dusky Arkansas hills, the forest deepening around us. The tires crunched gravel as he turned onto a side road, Mountain View Road, barely more than a path through the wilderness. I kept my headlights dim and my distance farther back, my heart pounding. I stayed on the line with Detective Miller, reporting our movements. "He's pulling over," I whispered. "Eagle Point Lookout, about 10 miles northeast of town." She told me to stay in the car, but as I watched him haul a shovel and a plastic-wrapped bundle from his trunk, instinct overtook protocol. I stepped out. The scent of pine and river moss filled the air as I followed him down the trail, flashlight off. I moved silently. The only sounds were the chirping cicadas and the distant rush of water below. He didn't hear me until I was almost behind him. "Reverend George," I called. He jumped, nearly dropping the shovel. When he turned, I saw the fear on his face transform into fury. "Marcus," he said sharply, "why are you here?" "I could ask you the same," I said, glancing at the bag. "What's in there?" He didn't answer. I pressed further. "Is it my father? Did you dig him up?" The bag slipped from his hand. Something solid inside clanked against the wooden railing. "Stay back," he hissed. "You don't understand." I stepped closer. "Then help me. Help me understand." He looked toward the trail, toward the sound of approaching sirens. Then back to me. Panic settled over him like a fog. "It was Harold's idea," he said suddenly. "We didn't mean to. Not at first." I grabbed the bag and opened it. Inside were 2 books my father's missing. 1977 sermon notebook and his diary. Beneath them, a cloth bundle, partially unwrapped. Bone fragments. Ash. Sirens wailed louder. George turned to the edge of the cliff. "Don't!" I shouted, lunging forward. But he was already climbing the railing. 2 officers burst down the stairs and caught him just as he was about to leap. They dragged him back, kicking and sobbing. One of them muttered, "You won't escape judgment that easily." Back at the police station, the evidence was laid out: the sermon notes, the diary, the financial stewardship book. Forensic officers carefully opened the diary. Most of it was pulp, but some pages had survived. One passage read, "I can no longer ignore the missing funds. I have spoken to Harold and George. They deny everything. But I have prayed for strength to confront them before the congregation." It was enough. George confessed within hours. The confrontation, the rage, the accidental death, the cover-up. Harold and George had buried my father in the church cemetery, under a pet's grave. The evidence-robed Bible diary, hidden in the forest under a tree stump. Their motive: fear, greed, and racism still lingering in the veins of 1977 Arkansas. Detective Miller placed a hand on my shoulder. "Thanks to you, your father will finally get justice." I nodded, unable to speak. I had found his final resting place. His name could be cleared. And perhaps, just perhaps, I could find my faith again. The next morning the sun rose over the Ozarks with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. But my heart was anything but calm. I stood outside Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church as officers finished sealing off the cemetery. Pastor Harold had been arrested just before dawn. His expression had been one of weary resignation, not surprise. Detective Miller met me at the church steps. "We'll need your help sorting through your father's office. If those men kept other records hidden, they could be there." We stepped inside. The sanctuary still smelled of varnish and hymnals, but now it was eerily silent. George's confession echoed in my mind, the argument, the struggle the body buried beneath the guise of a loyal pastor's honor. I entered the church library again, this time not as a son seeking closure, but as a man looking for truth. The library's tall bookshelves stood like sentinels. The borrowed financial stewardship book lay open on a reading table where I'd left it after the night's chaos. I ran my fingers over my father's handwriting in the margins. His script had always been careful, full of conviction. On one page he had written, "Righteousness must shine, even in the darkest places. A shepherd cannot allow the wolves to walk freely among the flock." I understood now. He had known, and he had tried to stop it. Detective Miller's voice brought me back. "We found something under the floorboards of Reverend George's office." I followed her to the corner room. Officers had removed a plank near the old desk. Inside was a dusty metal box. We opened it together. Inside were documents, ledgers, tithe records, handwritten receipts. Most were from 1975 to 1977. My father's name was signed on many, but his notes were often amended. And beside those notes, more of his handwriting. Inconsistent entries. No accountability from treasurers. Funds missing. It was a record of suspicion carefully documented. He hadn't just been a preacher. He had been a silent auditor, watching over the congregation's faith and finances alike. One folder held a sealed envelope addressed to the church deacons. It was dated April 8, 1977, the day before he vanished. With trembling hands I opened it. Inside was a letter. "To my fellow servants in Christ, it is with a heavy heart that I write this. I have discovered misappropriations of our sacred resources. I implore those responsible to come forward. If this is not addressed before Sunday, I will speak to the congregation myself. Truth must not be silenced." Detective Miller exhaled slowly. He was planning to expose them that Sunday. They couldn't allow it. As the evidence mounted, so did the emotional weight. The truth was now undeniable. My father had been silenced because he stood for what was right. Because he believed the church must be above reproach. A week later, after DNA confirmation, we held a memorial. For the first time in 25 years, the church was full. People came from across the state. Some remembered my father fondly. Others admitted they had believed the worst. I stood at the pulpit, the very one he had once stood behind, and read from his final sermon notes. His April 1977 message was titled, "The Cost of Righteousness." He had written, "Sometimes standing for the truth will cost you everything. But the Lord remembers those who do not bend." Tears rolled down my face as I looked at the congregation. My father paid that cost, but today we restore his name. And in doing so, we restore our own faith in justice. After the service, I walked to his new grave, a proper one. A granite headstone now bore his name. Reverend Elijah Freeman, 1942-1977. He walked in the truth and did not waver. As I stood there, I felt a presence beside me. It was Robbie, the boy from the cemetery. "Your dad was a good man," he said softly, "and you helped make it right." I smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No, Robbie, God made it right. I was just the one willing to listen." The weeks that followed brought a mixture of peace healing and unresolved questions. Although Pastor Harold and Reverend George were formally charged with murder, obstruction of justice, and embezzlement, their trial was months away. In the meantime, I found myself stepping back into the role I had run from for so long, my father's son and a servant to truth. The church congregation, shaken by the revelations, looked to me for guidance. Not because I was a pastor, I wasn't, but because I was the son of one who had never betrayed them. I started visiting the church more frequently, meeting with the board, reviewing the finances, and even helping with sermons. It felt like a heavy cloak had been passed to me, not of burden, but of purpose. One Sunday after service, an elderly woman approached me in tears. "I was here the last Sunday before your father disappeared," she said. "He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. I didn't understand then, but I do now. He was protecting us." Her words became the core of what I began to believe. My father's final days weren't marked by despair, but by courage. He chose to protect the sanctity of his ministry, even if it cost him his life. During this time, I was also frequently visiting the boy Robbie. His health had improved, and he was staying temporarily in a foster home, while the state investigated his aunt and uncle. I began to see the boy not as a chance encounter, but a divine interruption. His innocence, his curiosity, his desire to be good, they stirred something in me. One afternoon, I took him to the old Freeman house, the home where I grew up. It had long been sold, but the current owners were kind enough to let me show Robbie around. The porch creaked the same way. The oak tree out front still had the tire swing my father had built. As we walked the halls, I narrated memories like a tour guide of my own childhood. "Right here," I said, pointing to the study, "this is where my dad used to write his sermons. He would hum hymns while he worked, and every Saturday night he'd kneel right by that window to pray." Robbie looked around wide-eyed. "Do you think he heard God when he prayed?" I smiled. "I think God heard him. And I think in some way God answered, just not in the way we expected." That evening I visited the detective's office. Detective Miller had compiled all the recovered documents and files into one massive binder labeled Freeman Case. She handed it to me. "This is everything: your father's notes, financial documents, witness testimonies. This case will be one of the most significant in our department's history." I took the binder home and sat with it for hours. Page after page, I traced the slow, courageous path my father had taken to uncover the truth. His journal entries grew heavier in tone, but never lost faith. One particular entry stood out: "I fear what is coming. I know I am being watched, but I cannot turn away. God gave me a flock, and I will not abandon them to wolves. Even if I am taken, I pray the Lord sends someone to finish the work." I wept. It was a father's final prayer, a cry into the void he hoped someone would one day answer. And I had. In late spring, the trial finally began. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, church members, and curious townspeople filled every seat. I took the stand as the primary witness, recounting everything: the phone call, the discovery, the books, the confrontation at Eagle Point Lookout. When George testified, he broke down several times. He admitted everything: the forged documents, the arguments, the plan to silence my father. He claimed he had lived with guilt every day since. Pastor Harold, however, remained cold and defiant. His lawyer tried to paint my father as unstable, even fabricating stories of mental illness and depression. But the jury didn't believe it. The evidence was too strong. The documentation, the confessions, the recovered remains. Justice was finally in motion. In June, both men were sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom erupted in quiet relief. Outside, members of Mount Olive gathered in prayer, not just for justice, but for healing. That Sunday, I delivered a message in the sanctuary. "I am not a pastor," I told them, "but I am the son of one who lived and died with conviction. My father gave everything for this place, for the truth, and we must honor that by keeping this church a place of light." I stepped away from the pulpit and knelt where he had once knelt. The congregation joined me. Tears flowed, voices lifted in song. Later, we held a proper funeral for Elijah Freeman, reinterring his remains in a place of honor on church grounds. A marble plaque now rests beneath the pulpit in memory of Reverend Elijah Freeman. 1942 to 1977, he stood for truth even unto death. I didn't return to my old job. I couldn't. Instead, I began speaking to churches, schools, and organizations about integrity, faith, and legacy. I told them my father's story. I told them how truth, though buried, cannot be silenced forever. Robbie sometimes joined me. He would stand shyly beside me, holding my hand. In time, he became my son, not by blood, but by choice. The state granted me guardianship, and we moved back into the Freeman house. He now sleeps in my old room. One night, after I finished reading him a bedtime story from the Bible, he looked up at me. "Mr. Marcus, do you think your dad would be proud of you?" I didn't answer immediately. I thought about everything, the pain, the journey, the justice. "I hope so," I said. "I think he'd say, 'Well done, my son, you walked in truth.'" And in that quiet room, with the past finally at rest and the future just beginning, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: peace.